afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. My name is Laquore Meadows. I'm a member of the CMC Board of Trustees, and I also serve as the Director of OSU Extension here in Franklin County. It's such a pleasure to see everyone today. So today, we have a wonderful panel assembled. The Columbus Metropolitan Club is pleased to present Lessons from Weinland Park, Urban Revitalization, which is sponsored by our friends at the Columbus Foundation. And they're represented today by many of their friends and associates. So can you please help me to thank the Columbus Metropolitan Club for their sponsorship? Neighborhoods are the building blocks of communities. They provide personality and a sense of place, block by block, to the fabric of the village. Some neighborhoods are magnets, drawing people, culture, and investment, while weaker neighborhoods struggle, demonstrating challenges to both people and property in plain sight. Everyone deserves to live in a clean and safe neighborhood, and we will all be better for it when we achieve this goal. Let's hear from some experts who make it their life's work to impact neighborhoods for the better. Please join me in welcoming the Director of Community Research at the Columbus Foundation, Michael Wilcos. City of Columbus Director of the Department of Neighborhoods, Carla Williams-Scott. Joining us from Pittsburgh, the president and founder of SmallChange.com, Eve Picker. And our host, Mark Ferenchik, journalist with the Columbus Dispatch. Michael will start us off with an overview of the Weinland Park study. Then Mark Ferenchik will lead our discussion this afternoon. Michael, the podium is yours.
Great, thank you. Since I moved here in 1988 to finish my degree at Ohio State, the city of Columbus has grown by over 241,000 people. There was no Tuttle Crossing, Polaris, or Easton, and the short north had more vacancies than it had restaurants. Nothing really stays the same. And certainly big changes are underway across Columbus's urban neighborhoods. Weinland Park of 2017 is very different than the one of, say, 10 years ago, and it is worlds apart from the neighborhood I first saw in 1988. My very first apartment in Columbus 29 years ago just happened to be on the very same street I now own a home. And despite several moves in between, I am now living just 0.7 miles away from where I started my adult life. When we talk about neighborhood change, it is usually an overly simplistic narrative of either good or bad change. And good or bad is relative. What's good for me may be bad for you. And it may be an easy conclusion to say that my living in Weinland Park in some ways harms or displaces low-income families, that I am a gentrifier. That is, if you want to define me based on a series of census classifications on race, education, income, or the fact that I already told you that I own a home. But those categories do not describe how I feel in my heart, and they certainly do not describe how I behave. The issue of gentrification is very personal, and we all have different ideas about what it means. The debate over good or bad neighborhood change normally falls very short of historical and complex issues of race, class, economics, and governmental policy. In the simplest of terms, there are two patterns of neighborhood revitalization: those that focus on real estate or place, and those focused on existing residents or people. If we focus only on place and make communities cleaner and safer and economically viable, it often leads to displacement of low-income residents. If we focus only on existing people as their lives improve with more opportunity, often people will do what is best for them and their families, and they will move to communities that are safer, with better schools and greater prospects. And when that happens, left behind are neighborhood and families in distress. Weinland Park represents a blend of both place and people approaches. In 2010, after 15 years of investment by the City of Columbus and The Ohio State University, the Weinland Park Collaborative was formed to invest in education, employment, health, housing, resident engagement, safety, and positive youth development. And the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity was hired to help us understand how our investments are working, replicating a survey that was last done in 2010 to capture change after years of consistent and considerable investment in neighborhood stabilization. 422 residents were interviewed and hundreds of charts and tables were produced, all of which will be publicly released today. And for me, there are three big takeaways. One, there are many accomplishments in Weinland Park to celebrate. Two, success is not evenly felt for all residents, and challenges persist for families trying to break the cycle of poverty. And three, after 2 decades of considerable investment, the work is not done. Some of the positive key findings. Demographically, the neighborhood looks quite similar to the neighborhood of 2010. Yet, more residents are working, fewer are behind on their bills, and they are less likely to use payday lending. 75% of the residents think their neighborhood is getting better, only 2% think it's getting worse. And far more residents feel that their voice matters in decision-making, and the neighborhood is no longer a hotspot for infant mortality. Yet, some disappointing findings exist as well. Residents using government assistance has essentially stayed the same at 51%. 89% of residents are still renters, virtually unchanged from 6 years ago. And approximately 1/5 of renters still need government assistance to pay their rent. Chronic disease management, food insecurity, and lack of primary care keep residents from achieving better health outcomes. And may be surprising to some, although not to our researchers who are national experts in racial bias, we now more fully understand differences in the perceptions of safety based on race, age, and gender that new data visualization tools now reveal. And let me be clear, we are not talking about the differences in people's views between Silicon Valley and Appalachia, but the different experiences and perceptions of people who live on the same block. Understanding these biases is critical to help us better understand how to organize residents, deliver programs and services, and communicate with residents. What we say and what people hear can be very different. And we must understand the difference between equality and equity. Kirwan researchers and our national experts from the Annie E. Casey Foundation are helping us become more effective in this work. And we also know that although Weinland Park is unique in its transformation, the issues yet to tackle in that neighborhood are not specific to Weinland Park, but are pervasive across our country. And just a few of those include the need for more living wage employment, because wages are not matching the rising cost of housing. Reducing chronic poverty requires people-focused, not agency-focused approaches, and authentic relationship building. And collecting and sharing data so organizations can see an entire family holistically and provide assistance when it's needed. And addressing the root causes of academic underperformance requires a family and community-based solution. The Kirwan study measured the physical, social, and economic perceptions of change so we can be good stewards of our public and philanthropic dollars and understand community change. And in the end, cities are often only seen as bricks and sticks. But the far more interesting part of cities is the mortar between the bricks, the social connectedness that holds communities together. And Weinland Park in 10 years will not look like the neighborhood it is today, and we shouldn't expect it to. But it does give us an opportunity to learn from and build from an example of what it takes to achieve a mixed race, mixed income community and honor the goal for all of our neighbors to meet their full potential. Thank you.
So Michael had a lot of interesting things to say. I wanted to ask Carla to see what her take was on the survey, and also how the findings with this survey with Weinland Park could be applied perhaps to other neighborhoods if something like this should be done in other Columbus neighborhoods.
Thanks, Mark. Absolutely. So currently at the city, we are working in the Linden neighborhood, and we'll also be doing a master plan in the Hilltop soon to come. And looking at some of the key findings from the survey, some of the major things that we're looking at now are employment, transportation, access to employment. And I think Michael hit on that you're seeing some of the same statistics of individuals that are still living at the poverty level and on public assistance. And so absolutely we'll be focusing on employment, and education and workforce are just a few of the key areas.
How could the city work in those areas? What ideas do you have, or does the mayor's office have to make those improvements?
Some of the things we're looking at now is working with our partners on our Smart Columbus grant, and again, focusing on transportation, access to transportation. The Linden community is close to one of the largest workforce areas, employers, the Easton area. And so working and looking at Smart Columbus and looking at what some of the transportation challenges are for the residents that live in that community to be able to get to and from some of the jobs at Easton, and then also beginning to branch out and look at some of the jobs that are on the outskirts of the city, and looking at some of the transportation challenges to get residents to those jobs as well.
Eve, you're can you tell us a little bit about what you're involved with in Pittsburgh, and you looked at Weinland Park, I know, today. Tell us how that could be applied here in Columbus, perhaps.
Sure. So my background is in the built environment. I'm an architect by training, and I have a master's in urban design. And my company, Small Change, really connects investors with developers who are doing transformative real estate projects in places where traditional financial institutions are unlikely to lend enough money to make those projects happen. That's basically it.
Why are banks still hesitant to become involved in some of these areas where there has been work done? A lot of it's been public money invested at first, but why are banks still hesitating to get involved in areas like a Weinland Park or Linden or the Hilltop?
Well, I can't speak to how banks feel about those particular neighborhoods, but I've seen neighborhoods like that all over the country, and certainly in Pittsburgh, where I live. And basically banks, will look for comparables. They want to see a marketplace, and they will agree to lend money based on a marketplace. And if a neighborhood doesn't have enough value to them or to the appraiser who looks at this for them, then you can't borrow enough money to do that first project that's going to make a change, or that project does something a little differently. You won't be able to raise enough money, which is where city governments usually come in, and all sorts of alternative financing sources that make developers who work in these neighborhoods so very creative.
Can you give us one example in Pittsburgh of a project that you work on, and how because again, you're involved in
Oh yes, I can.
Basically crowdfunding.
Sure, crowdfunding. Small Change is crowdfunding. It's really like Kickstarter, but for real estate. And instead of making a donation, you invest, so you get your money back, hopefully with a return. This is really investment crowdfunding. So, and it's governed by securities laws. So it's really a different animal. And where I see the opportunity is that neighbors can engage in their neighborhood to help make projects like this happen. They can be investors in the neighborhood they live in, and I think that's an amazing opportunity. So I own a building in Pittsburgh that I purchased from the city about 13 years ago, and it's a gorgeous historic building. It had been vacant for 15 years. You could fly a small plane through the roof. It was in really bad shape. Literally, it was a very historic building, and the only thing we could save was the exterior walls. And at the time, and the Urban Redevelopment Authority in Pittsburgh no longer has this type of financing, but at the time it took 12 sources of financing to get that project constructed. So in that neighborhood, which was predominantly African American, which means poor in Pittsburgh, the construction costs were going to be about $2 million, and I could only get a bank loan of $400,000 because that's the only value the bank saw. So I got historic tax credits and matching facade grants, and I begged $50,000 from the mayor, and I mean, anything I could cobble together to get that project done. And that is a really common story for developers who go into these neighborhoods and want to do that first of project that is really necessary. It's a difficult conversation. Do you leave that building empty, or do you make it the center of a community and risk gentrification? It's a very difficult conversation. So fast forward 15 years, and that building is actually, we're crowdfunding $300,000 for it today. And why are we doing that? Because it's really the same story again. It's still in the same neighborhood. Now we want to convert the building into a full building co-working space. That we have a tenant that's filled 50% of the space, and they want to take over the whole building. And it's never been done before. So I go back to the bank and I say, could you give us a credit line for $250,000 so we can do tenant fit out and build out furniture? We think we're going to do very well with this. Here are all the numbers. And the bank says, we can't give you a credit line because we've never seen anything like this before. So, it's a perpetual problem.
And I was going to ask Carla about that too. It's like when you're dealing with the private sector to try to help out on financing projects in neighborhoods like this, how difficult is it to get them involved or to get them interested?
It absolutely is, Mark. Part of the issue is, as Eve just mentioned, is what the lending institutions see as the value of the community. And then when you talk in terms of the residents there, a lot of the residents are unbanked. I think Michael mentioned that as well. You have individuals that don't use banks, that use payday lending institutions. And so it makes it very difficult to kind of focus around financing for, say if you're in the community, you've lived there for a long time, you need to do repairs on your home, but you don't use a bank. So it makes it very difficult for those residents to be able to access that kind of funding.
Right. I was going to ask Michael too, how much money, if you know, over the years, again, the Weinland Park Collaborative, which is a group of, again, foundations, the university, the city, and others, how much has been invested in Weinland Park so far, public and private, roughly?
So I want to first wind the clock back a little bit and be very clear that the work in Weinland Park has really been underway for 22 years. And if it was not for the leadership of the Ohio State University and the City of Columbus, the successes in Weinland Park over the last 6 years, as evidenced in the Kerwin research, probably would not have occurred. So this is really, in my opinion, government really showing leadership and doing what government should do. Invest in neighborhoods where the private sector does not want to go, invest comprehensively and significantly, and then wanting the private market to respond. So if you go back to that original investment of Campus Gateway in 1995, Weinland Park has been blessed with literally tens and tens of millions of dollars of federal, state, and city money that has only recently resulted in private sector investment following. And one great example of that would be the Kroger on High Street. I am certain that Kroger on High Street was waiting for years to see whether or not the entire near north side of Columbus was going to stabilize, survive, or thrive. And when finally they, as a private sector entity, thought there was a market, they invested in that store. And so Weinland Park is not a food desert like many neighborhoods or like Linden. And so hopefully the government can learn from some of the successes in Weinland Park, invest in Linden, and hopefully that private sector will follow. To answer your question more directly, it's hard to capture those dollars because some of these things take a long time. The acquisition of former factory sites, Columbus Coated Fabric and 3M, they take years to acquire, then do demolition and environmental remediation. But I would say overall, since this initiative started in Weinland Park, we're probably looking at well over $250 million that has gone into Weinland Park in federal, state, local, and private sector and philanthropic dollars. But keep in mind, South Campus Gateway and some of these projects on High Street represent very big price tag projects.
For Michael and Carla, in going through the survey, was there anything that stood out to you that was surprising before you went into it? In other words, if you thought that questions were going to be answered one way and the survey showed something else?
I think for me, it was the fact that the makeup of the neighborhood hasn't changed very much. It was surprising and yet pleasantly surprising at the same time. I think as we look at doing work in the two communities that we're working in, one of the things we want to make sure is that we provide an opportunity for those residents that live there that they can stay there. And so, and those residents that want to move out have better employment opportunities, better education opportunities, and have the opportunity to do so. And so I think looking at the survey, that was one of the things that was surprising to me.
Yeah, Michael?
I'm going to agree with Carla on that. I think that many of us have very clear mental models of what we think low-income communities are supposed to look like. And if we go into those neighborhoods and we don't see vacant and abandoned properties and litter and graffiti and people hanging out in front of carryouts, we automatically assume that that neighborhood has experienced gentrification. But one of the things that the Weinland Park Collaborative really was committed to was making sure that you, as a visitor to that neighborhood, would not be able to make a judgment based on the income of the folks who live there, based on what you perceive to be the architectural quality of that housing stock. So you go into Weinland Park today, and some of the highest quality housing is owned by Community Properties of Ohio. Nonprofit owned and managed low-income housing that is well managed. I think most people have a negative reaction to affordable housing because often it may not be well maintained. And in Weinland Park, it's well maintained. So I live right across the street from Section 8 housing owned by Community Properties of Ohio. And friends of mine who would visit prior to its renovation and then after its renovation would say, how much did those condos sell for? No, those are not condos, right? That is low-income housing. And if you can't tell the difference, then that is changing your mental model of what you think low-income people deserve. And I believe that low-income people deserve the same quality of housing that I deserve. And that is what's happened in Weinland Park. And when you come into that neighborhood, it is Habitat for Humanity and low-income housing tax credits and philanthropy-funded home repair programs for existing residents. But when you come onto that street, you're going to have a hard time telling what product is what. And that's government leadership.
And I was going to ask you too, Michael, talked about the future and fears of gentrification. Based on how things are going and based on what the market is like in this town anymore, at least for the time being, what do you think Weinland Park is going to be in 10 to 20 years? How do you see it evolving, changing, growing?
Sure. You know, Weinland Park is small. It's 28 square blocks. It's 0.36 square miles. No matter how good we are at providing a diversity of housing product in that neighborhood, we are never going to have the housing product that someone needs on the day they need it that fits their income or lifestyle choice. So that's just a reality. And there are more affordable and government-assisted housing products and units in Weinland Park today than there were in 2010. And yes, I'm worried about housing prices going up. There is a gap, right? There are a number of products that serve people at 30 or 60% of area median income and below, and we penalize people as they have barriers removed and become more economically self-sufficient. There is this big gap. When they leave that subsidized product, then they're thrown into the private market, and there isn't anything in between. So I worry about those folks, and that is an unintended consequence of the success in Weinland Park. But the solution to this issue will not be found on the streets of Weinland Park. This is a citywide challenge. It is a national challenge. And I believe the bigger part of the debate that we're not talking about enough is the suppression of wages for far too many people in our society, because we have too many sectors of the economy that are simply not producing a living wage so people can afford decent housing. And that's the companion piece to this discussion.
Eve, with some of the projects that you've done in Pittsburgh and other communities, can you tell us a little bit about how they've transformed or changed the areas that they're in? Have they made a difference in those neighborhoods?
Yeah, but I have these ideas about what small change or crowdfunding can do for neighborhoods like this that I've thought about for a long time, that I'd really rather talk about. Is that okay? So I have been involved in real estate for a long time and in nonprofit work, so I'm very familiar with the sort of work that happens in neighborhoods like this, and the role of government. So I think equity crowdfunding is really is just only starting. It's only sort of scratching the edges, and I think it holds the promise of letting a lot of people into investment opportunities who've never had that opportunity before. Never. Okay, so I think it's a way of building assets for people who live in those communities, as well as making those communities better places. So one particular SEC regulation called Regulation A, it permits you to raise $50 million. Okay, you have to go to the SEC and get it approved, but you can put out an offering for $50 million, and then you can use that offering to build things. And different people could invest in that offering. It could be institutions that invest that might invest for a very small return and perhaps they get CRA credits in return, or perhaps it's foundations who invest at very low interest rates. But neighbors in that community might invest and get a slightly better return. And now you have a pool of funds that might replicate what happened in Weinland Park, that engages the community, engages a lot of people, and can really start to really make a really big change. And so I think there are a number of tools, securities tools, that are being used by crowdfunding platforms. That's one of them that I think about that a lot. I think it could be, at the moment, that particular regulation is being used to create what are called e-REITs, and it's financing, buildings for the sake of making a return, not buildings for the sake of making better neighborhoods. So I think, someone could start thinking about this and do something really big. And then there's regulation crowdfunding, which lets anyone over the age of 18 invest. So now you have a tool that you could deploy in a neighborhood. Say you want to get that Kroger's built 2 years earlier than Kroger's wants to do it. And you go to Kroger's and you say, okay, we will raise $500,000 from the community if you do this today, not in 2 years. And people can invest in it. So I think there's some really different opportunities to be had. And this is why I'm doing this, because I've seen this sort of work for decades, and I think it really presents an opportunity.
In a few minutes, we're going to go to audience questions. So the microphone is in the back. If anybody's interested in asking our panel anything about what we talked about today. For a final question, just wanted to ask the panel about, as we move forward, as we have concerns about income inequality here, about neighborhoods, how they're changing, how there's a divide between neighborhoods. What can the public and private sectors do together to start to deal with making sure that there's affordable housing in the community that's also quality housing?
One of the things that we're looking at in the work that we're doing at the city, I think Michael mentioned, Weinland Park had help. They had assistance from Ohio State and others that are kind of anchoring that community. Unfortunately, Linden and Hilltop don't have those anchors, and so at the city, we're working with the private sector and developers and investors to be Linden champions, to come and we know that the work is going to be hard, it's going to be a long haul, And yeah, you might not make money on this deal, but it's interesting, some of the folks that we've talked to said they know this is the right thing to do. And so while I know organizations that are in the business of making money aren't gonna forego making a profit all the time, they know that it's the right thing to do and that they're committed and willing to do it. So it's gotta be that partnership between the public sector and private sector.
Well, I mean, I think that there's an opportunity to look beyond partnerships that have been used before, and it's really a repeat of what I said before. But I do think there are other ways to raise large pools of funds that that communities haven't thought about before, and I think that could be pretty groundbreaking.
Okay, Michael?
I certainly think that we all have to recognize that government is certainly not going to be the solution to affordable housing moving forward in this country. And as I look out into the audience, there are a number of people in this room who are working on creative solutions that are unique to Columbus to address that gap in the housing product. But there's one other point that I want to make sure that we get across in this conversation, and that is everybody in a neighborhood has a gift to give. And really recognizing asset-based community development, and to build off what Eve was saying about crowdsource funding to get folks in a community to support a development project. When you look at those photographs on the placemat that was left for you today, you see all of these different ways in which people are giving their gifts in a community. And that can be crowdsourced funding for urban revitalization, but it could also be about community organizing, and it could also be doing something about what you're passionate about. And really what gets done in a community is what people care about, and we have to honor and respect that and provide people with the technical tools, whether that's volunteer management or financial tools, so they can give their gift in the way they want to give it. And that is too often missing in low-income communities where we don't see low-income people as assets. And that was one of the last findings that shocked me in the Kerwin study, is that we now understand that low-income residents are assets to their neighbors and to their community in ways that we previously didn't fully understand.
Okay. Thank you very much. Right now is the time for questions. It's the Metropolitan Club's tradition to take audience questions now. Please state your name. For those who are interested, ask your question. And we thank you in advance for not making long editorial remarks or speeches. First question goes to Brian.
Brian Williams, Weinland Park resident and member of the University Area Commission. One real concern in Weinland Park is transitional, affordable rental housing, so that as low-income people start to climb the economic ladder, can they climb the housing ladder and stay in the same neighborhood? One thing that we're hearing some talk about in Weinland Park, some people who are interested in, excuse me, some kind of a urban land trust that would help facilitate this. And I'm just wondering if anybody has any thoughts about that or knows of any models. I wonder if that fits in with the crowdfunding and that sort of thing.
I don't know so much about urban land trust, but I could imagine that if a group of neighbors wanted to buy land and create a trust, you could certainly use crowdfunding to raise the funds. It's just one of many tools, I think. Do you know a little more about it?
So I think, Brian, what you are really introducing is the fact that, again, government is not going to be the solution, and I believe that we have deployed every tool that we currently have at our disposal in Columbus to serve distressed and low-income families in Weinland Park, and yet there is this gap. So land trust is one solution. Another idea that's been discussed is looking at these doubles in Weinland Park, potentially having one side of that double be a child care center and the person live on the other side of the double, and then they have the opportunity to be having a small business and also generating revenue while serving low-income families in their need to have high-quality, affordable child care so they can enter the job market. There has to be lots of different tools. Land trust is one of those non-governmental tools that we must pursue to fill that gap.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sophie Smith Campbell, and I'm a high school student at the Arts and College Preparatory Academy. So my question is sort of, I grew up in Southern Ohio, in Vinton County, which is a food desert here in Ohio. And you guys have been talking a lot about the inner city, but what are we doing to help the low-income families in Appalachia and Southern Ohio? Because we have a lot of the same problems there, like everyone's on government funding and no one has quite enough money to buy food and stuff. So yeah, that's my question.
I think that might be more of a statewide issue. I think what we're focusing on is Columbus Center City, but I think that some of the same things that we're doing and that we're talking about in Columbus would certainly be transferable to Appalachia and to other areas of the state. And again, it's trying to get government to be a catalyst to get things going, and then where you have the private sector there that can kind of help to do that. And maybe in Southern Ohio, it might be more on the government side, and then private investors participating.
I mean, I think you raise one of the most difficult questions that this country is going to face, and that is structural economic changes in the economy that simply have removed living wage employment for people who don't have college educations or a technical skill. And small towns in Ohio, for sure, are taking the brunt of that change. And it is unlikely, given artificial intelligence and some of the automation in the economy, that some of these small towns are going to see the return of living wage employment. So they have a very different set of challenges, and that does lead to a governmental intervention for those folks. But as someone who grew up in Youngstown and had to make that decision when that economic carpet was pulled out from that community, do I stay or do I go? And the sad part is that tens of thousands of young people are making that decision all over small towns in Ohio and across the country, and too many of them are leaving and not going back.
Yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Meg Tieford. So I didn't get a chance to read this report yet, but I wanted to know about who left the outmigration, and if you know where those people went, because obviously some people did leave, even if the profile looks the same. And I wondered also what percentage of the existing population are homeowners today.
So the home ownership rate in Weinland Park has consistently stayed under 10%, and that has been true for some time. We do not have the data that shows what neighborhoods folks moved to when they left, but there is data that shows what neighborhoods individuals were living in prior to living in Weinland Park. The other thing that I think most of you will find exciting, for those of you that are data geeks, and I want to identify Zachary Kennitzer, if you raise your hand. You can see that gentleman at the end of the meeting, who is one of the lead researchers behind this report. There are these really specialized demographic clusters of residents, and so folks in Weinland Park may all share the same physical space, but they view the world differently and they behave differently, and we do have some data about what neighborhoods people were living in previously to coming into Weinland Park. Keep in mind, some of the residents in Weinland Park are housing consumers of choice. They can choose to live anywhere. Some of them are choosing to live in Weinland Park because they have a religious, spiritual, and moral compass of wanting to live a connected life. Some of them are moving into Weinland Park because they got a voucher, and that's where they ended up. And hopefully for many of them, they're having a good experience. But there are lots of different reasons why people are coming in and coming out, and the gentleman right in front of you can probably answer those questions for you.
Oh, I was hoping somebody would come up. Yes, go ahead.
Sorry. So as you pointed out, one of the biggest problems in Weinland Park and throughout the country is the lack of paying jobs that will support a living wage for a family. What is Columbus doing, and what do the speakers think we should be doing to try to change that situation? Thank you.
I think one of the things that we're looking at as we do our work in the Linden community is looking at job training and looking at education. You know, college isn't for everybody, and so we have young people coming out of high school that may not want to go to college. What opportunities are there? What can we do as we're talking about neighborhood transformation? What opportunities can we have for them in terms of workforce development? And then looking at some of the folks that are in the community, what opportunities are there for them to live and work in the community, where they live? And so those are some of the things that we'll be looking at going forward. Certainly with our partners at OSU and the Neighborhood Design Center that are working with us on this work, we're focusing on health, education, safety, workforce. And so looking at opportunities where, again, where people can work in the communities they live, and if they choose to work outside of that, their community, that they have transportation and access to get to those jobs. A lot of times the higher paying jobs may not be where you are, and so the issue is how do you get there?
So I think there's two ways to look at the issue. My good friend Robert Caldwell once said to me, the reason why someone doesn't make it to work at 7 o'clock in the morning didn't happen at 6 a.m. that day, usually happened the night before, right? What are preventing people from getting a full-time job and keeping a full-time job from January 1st through December 31st? It's chronic disease management, it's lack of transportation, it's unstable housing, it's all kinds of stuff. And so, one, we have to have a holistic set of interventions that support that individual so they can get that full-time job and keep it year-round. The other thing is the harder part. And if you want to stay up late at night and scare yourself, read the book Humans Need Not Apply, because it's talking about this wave of structural changes in the economy that are literally going to take lots of jobs away from people. And honestly, I don't know what the solution is going to be to that. Columbus has built a reputation as a logistics and warehouse and distribution center. If in 10 or 20 years the Amazon facility on the Far East Side is able to produce the same amount of products in and out of that building with only 10 people that now require 1,000, we're going to have to do something different, right? And I don't know what that looks like yet, but it's coming and we need to get prepared for it.
I'm Laura Fish with Jewish Family Services and Workforce Development, and I really liked how you said people in place both need to be invested in at the same time in order to be able to have progress. I know they're in the Milo Grogan area, which is pretty close to Weinland Park. There's currently an investment process going on that attends to the people side with connecting businesses and employment. I'm curious, though, after hearing place, what is the city doing right now to attend also at the same time to the other issues of place in the Milo Grogan area?
Part of what we're doing in citywide in the areas that we work in, we're making sure that we talk to the residents, that we listen to the residents and what it is they need. I think, Michael hit on that you can't have transformation in a community without focusing on the folks that are there and what they need. One of the things I keep saying as we go through this process that we're doing a plan with the residents in Linden and not a plan to the residents of Linden, because we can't come in and tell folks what they need and what they want. They have to be a part of that process. And I think that holistic approach will help to see that transformation in other areas like Milo Grogan, Linden, and the Hilltop. And hopefully in 10 years, we'll come back with a report and be talking about the change that has happened there.
And I also think Milo is particularly interesting because there are a lot of small businesses. As you drive through that neighborhood, there are very few vacancies and lots of what I would consider to be relatively good paying jobs. And I think we need to give the city of Columbus a heck of a lot of credit for landing Rogue. I understand there's already 675 people that work at that facility, and there are a number of additional jobs still yet to be filled. So what I think we can do as a community is remove those barriers so people can take advantage of those jobs at a place like Rogue, and the city needs to continue to do things like bring incredible entrepreneurs like Rogue into urban neighborhoods. But I would also say the people in place trajectory, the area around Nationwide Children's Hospital, the PACT neighborhood, Partners Achieving Community Transformation, Franklinton and Weinland Park. Those are all very interesting places where a lot of this people and place stuff is happening simultaneously. The goal is, as your life gets better, the neighborhood is getting better, and you see those things interwoven, so you choose to stay in your community as your life improves.
So, I mean, I think place is incredibly important. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. You want well-lit, clean streets. You want trees. You want parks for your kids to play in. You want a nice shopping district that you can walk through. So I think, in my mind, it doesn't matter if it's a low-income neighborhood or a median-income neighborhood or a wealthy neighborhood. Everyone deserves those things.
Do we have time for another question, or? No, okay. Well, I'll go back to Laquore. Yeah.
What an insightful discussion. Special thanks to each of you. Well, I hope you all enjoyed today's forum. You can view and share today's forum and all of our forums on CTV Columbus Television, on WOSU and PBS affiliates statewide, through the Ohio channel, and anytime on CMC's website via YouTube. Again, please help me thank our sponsor, the Columbus Foundation. Thank you so much. And also help me thank our wonderful panel today, Michael Wilcos, Eve Picker, Carla Williams-Scott, and Mark Ferenchik. And special thanks to each of you for being here today. We look forward to seeing you at CMC again next week. Have a great afternoon.